going live today to talk about next item in our series. I guess this is a series now, and this was one that I got a lot of questions about, and that's alternative burials or green or natural burials, just kind of alternative options outside of the standard cremation burial. I think originally cremation was an alternative. You know, it kind of came out of left field, and some people felt really strongly about it when it did start, but it gave people an option to take someone home at the end of everything rather than leave them at the cemetery. And it was kind of, it caught on. It became a really natural, quirky thing at the time. A lot of people chose it because they thought, well, we're not taking up ground space, we're not using up land. It's, you know, they wanted to be part of the new thing. But really, burial and cremation leave the same blueprint on the earth. They use up the same amount of energy, which may not make sense, but that burning process and emitting into the ozone and all of that takes place during cremation. So it is using up the same amount of resources. It just doesn't seem like it because cremation is only for a set period of time, and burial kind of takes the ground for forever. So there's some controversy, but in a lot of ways it does break even in the end. Now with cremation, Kari sent me a question that I hadn't touched on previously about scattering and kind of what the laws were, what the rules were on scattering when it came to cremation. So a funeral director being involved is until the final disposition. So for burial, it's the burial at the cemetery. For cremation, it's at the crematory. So once that's done, the funeral director is kind of out of it. And so a lot of times funeral directors will say, if I don't know, then it doesn't hurt anybody. Because I think a lot of what people do with cremated remains is really private, or they think it might be illegal, so they kind of do it secretively. It just depends on what you want to do. You can scatter cremated remains on private land if you have permission from the homeowner, obviously. There's not really many restrictions that are on paper, in books, anywhere about scattering in terms of public spaces, in terms of waterways. There's always some talk about, oh, you've got to be 3 miles off the shoreline, or Coast Guard regulations, but I can't ever seem to find anything in print or get actual technical information about it. I know when you go out on Lake Michigan, let's say, you're supposed to go with a person of legal stature, and it's supposed to be overseen and so forth, but I am betting that every year hundreds of people are tooling along in their boats and, you know, dropping somebody over the side casually, because there's nobody that monitors these type of things. There's nobody that's out writing tickets or arresting or giving out citations for spreading of cremated remains. I've heard just about every type of cremated remain scattering stories. There's been news articles about people who wanted to be scattered over their favorite baseball field or their favorite football field. I know one time the airplane pilot accidentally jogged, and so the person let go of the box and it came crashing through whichever, I think it was a baseball field, crashed through the roof of the baseball field area and made a big hole and a lot of damage. And so I think that's always something to take into account when, you know, they're scattering by air or anything like that, is what if you drop the person. I've heard of people being put in salt licks for deer because they wanted to go back into nature because they were hunters. One guy wanted to be paved back into the asphalt on a certain roadway when they did it, so he was supposed to go out, be put out when the road crew went. I don't even know if some of these are true, but there's always this talk within the industry. I think within any industry there's always the grand stories, which I'm going to address some of those that I know the factual answers to. But people come up with all sorts of off-the-wall things that they're going to do with loved ones when it comes to cremated remains. So I think a lot of what happens nowadays is this baby boom generation comes along, and it's, I want it my way, and I want to be unique, and I want to be different than everybody else. So everybody almost tries to, be better than the Joneses type of thing when it comes to every possible aspect of life, even death. So I think people try and one-up each other on what they're going to do. So then when it comes to kind of the next step of alternative is the natural and the green burial. Became a huge thing about 10-15 years ago when green burial became a discussion, where going out, putting somebody in a natural state, so no vault, no chemicals, so no embalming of any sort, either a biodegradable or a casket or no casket, where persons may be wrapped in like a burial shroud. I think one of the pictures I posted on the Facebook notification about this video was of a person wrapped in a shroud. So, there's different ways to do the natural burials and green cemeteries, green burial cemeteries. It just depends on what the rules are. So right now in and around Michigan, there are 7 cemeteries that are either have an area for green burial or they are full green burial. So there's not many. It's something that is regulated by so many different areas because of contaminants and things like that. It seems natural, but we put a lot into our bodies, and when you're buried, that goes back out into the earth. It goes back out into waterways. It goes back out into everything that's growing, and so that has to be regulated, just like burying anything that might affect what's growing around it and might affect what's living around it. So some of the green burial cemeteries, though, are just basically woods. If you get out into, like Oregon, areas that are very different than Michigan, it's more common, and they do have those more natural, amazing settings that you can just walk out and you'll see maybe like a little plaque that Mary Smith was buried there, but it's all very natural aside from this little, maybe like an engraved stone that sits there. So I know that I had a question locally about, burial in a cemetery just right around here. I'm in Wayland, so it was close to here, and it was a small rural cemetery, and they said if we wanted to do anything more natural at their cemetery, it would have to go before the board, and they would have to agree on something. So I think, if you're really for it and you're not near one of those cemeteries, you can always talk to your local cemetery and see what the rules are, see what they'd be willing to do. One way is to have a basic vault that still allows kind of moisture in and just be buried in a cardboard, a cardboard box type casket, so that it is more biodegradable and you're kind of meeting as much of your needs as possible. Some cemeteries also allow a bottomless vault. So the bottom of the casket is set on the soil, and then the top portion is covered with the concrete box, the vault. So that way you kind of biodegrade down far enough that they're not concerned, but that vault also secures the above grave from that driving over and things like that, as I had talked about in the vault casket urn video. So there are some different ways, but it's always asking the question. So that total cliche, if you don't ask the question, you're never going to know the answer. So there is a Green Burial Council that regulates all this, and they push for more cemeteries to join this. And one of the things that they have kind of started, it's called a low impact burial ground, and that's where certain cemeteries have allowed the Green Burial Council to come in and take over areas of their cemeteries to do green burials. So that way they kind of have it in one area, they know what's going on there, they can avoid that area for if they have to drive over for things. They don't have to put headstones, they don't have to have vaults, so they know that it's safe to bury people in that way in those areas. So that is one thing that's begun. Jeff had asked another question about, can you just go out and bury mom or dad in the backyard? And that kind of addresses into what's called a home burial. So a home burial is essentially dad dies, you don't involve anybody else, you go out and bury dad in the backyard. In Michigan, it is not legal. There's about 10 states that do not allow that without funeral home being involved, where a funeral home has to sign off on the death certificate, has to sign off on a permit, just so that somebody's regulating the death and overseeing that there's nothing suspicious. We are tracking where mom and dad are being buried. And so Michigan has said, yes, we want a funeral director involved with that. There's 5 states who have said, we don't want that happening at all. We're not even discussing it. There's no home burials. So in Michigan, it is allowed for a funeral home to help you do a burial at your house, but there is, of course, you have to get the health officers involved. Let me read the rulings that I wrote. Burial on owned land requires the health officials. You have to be 250 feet away from a well. The space has to be less than 1 acre that you're designating as a burial ground. And that land is not going to be taxed, again, because you're not using it for resale, essentially. It's probably it could probably hurt the resale of your home. But there's a lot of limitations put in there that, when you do sell your house, you have to provide a map of where this burial is. You have to ensure that longevity of that space, because you're essentially selling your mom and dad with that home sale when the time comes. So I think especially for families nowadays, we're so mobile. Who stays in the same home for 70 years anymore? I mean, there are people, yes, but it's not as common. Families fracture and everybody moves across the country and people move away. And I think that's one reason cremation kind of started becoming so that popular, because everybody you didn't get buried in the family plot anymore because the family was so scattered across the country or across the world. So I think with home burials, back in the day when that used to happen, back in the 1800s, where you lived on a farm and you buried the family out back, well, that was your family farm for generations. Nowadays, you live in a home for 5-10 years and then you move. So there's not a lot of people, I think, who would maybe, 1, feel comfortable doing that, and 2, know that they're going to be able to sell that home easily, having left mom or dad on the property. People cremate their pets and don't even want to bury them anymore. So I think it's probably not going to be a very common practice that happens. I know even with churches looking into getting cemeteries on their property, it's a huge lot of hoops, because what if that church closes down and then you have that property? What's going to happen to that cemetery? I think one church had told me they had to have this huge hefty insurance, so that way if the church disbanded or moved, then there would be money that would essentially go to the state, so that the state could care for that property, hopefully indefinitely. And I'm talking like $1 million insurance at least, to be able to do that. So there's a lot of restrictions, and they're in place for good reason, but definitely a lot of hoops. So a lot of other alternative burial options. Some of them have caught on. Some of them are not really catching on. They're running into a lot of issues. So the first is cryonics. So that's getting frozen. With medical, what's it called? I'm totally blank on that word. Looking into different health things, like you have a type of cancer and maybe it'll get cured one day. And so, okay, I'm going to freeze my body so that when they have a cure, they can unthaw my body and heal me. That's interesting. That you can also just freeze your head. So I don't know what purpose that serves at all. Maybe they can look at your head one day, but I'm not sure the whole rationale behind it. It's not something I would ever choose, obviously. But they gave pricing for $200,000 to do a whole body preservation, and then you can do a head only preservation for a one-time fee of $80,000. So it's interesting. So resumation is something that came out a few years ago, and a lot of people really liked the idea. So resumation is a really eco-friendly idea, and it's kind of like cremation in that what you would get back is the basic form of the bone broken down in a container. So it's essentially water and potassium hydroxide, kind of like lye, where it breaks down the body very quickly. So you basically do the decomposition within hours. And so you're left with this liquid portion and you're left with the bone portion. And so the liquid portion essentially is gone, is just washed away. And then you're left with the bone, which is given back to the body or to the family. So the church, the Catholic Church, had a lot of issues with discarding of the body essentially down a drain. So they kind of started the initial uproar against this process. So, but a lot of people like it because it is the most kind of natural way of decomposing, but having that cremation size amount of person to take home essentially of those bones. But there's been just too much legal battle over it. There's very few places in the country you can do it. Most states don't allow it. So it's just a huge legal battle. Space burial. So you literally send, it's more of like a cremate and then send your cremated remains up into space. So you can do just an orb where you can send up in the stratosphere or something, I don't even know, and then it'll come back down. And that's a minimum, I think that one was like 50,000. Or you could like send to outer space where you're going to actually orbit in space. So different off the wall things, but maybe you've always wanted to go to the moon and they can send you there after you've died. Plastination. So this process became kind of popular. The human body exhibit that was touring around, I think it's still touring around, but it was really big about, I want to say 5 years ago, that was coming to museums, and it was where it was real bodies, real body parts that had been treated with this process and essentially put on display, so you could see the whole vein structure, you could see the whole arterial structure, you could see muscles, you could see everything of a real person. So essentially plastic is, your body is plasticized. So the plastic replaces the water and fat in your body with silicone. And then once it has turned into plastic, the body is then displayed. So they inject and fill certain areas of you with plastic and then put you on display as an exhibit, and people pay money to come see you. So it's really interesting. I've always missed getting to go to the exhibit because that's something I would totally love seeing. But yeah, it's interesting. Memorial diamonds. This was something someone specifically had asked about. So a portion of the cremated remains or even hair is compressed into a gemstone. And then you can wear it, you can have it put into any jewelry you want. It's essentially just the same as any other gemstone. It's just created out of the natural elements of a human body. So everyone is going to be unique. Everyone is going to be, beautiful in its own way and reflective of that person to you. It doesn't take all of the cremated remains though. So you will then still have to decide what you're going to do with the remainder. So it is not a sole end point for all the cremated remains unless you did multiple gems, I guess. I think just like with when people wear jewelry that has cremated remains in them, it's one of those things like the Costco casket. I'm not going to tell you no, but I'm going to give you a little broader view of it. So how often do you lose a piece of jewelry? How often do you lose an earring? How often do you lose a ring, a diamond out of your ring, your necklace breaks and you don't even realize it? How often does that happen to you? It may not happen a lot, but if your necklace breaks and you have your mom's cremated remains, a little piece of her on that, and you lose that, how will you feel? Would you rather put her in a place that's safer, that she's still with you, or is it worth risking losing her when you're out and about? So I kind of preface it with that and just ask the question and let them make up their own opinion on what they want to do. So I think it's the same with those diamonds. I feel like I would, if you're spending that amount of money and your mom is in a diamond form, I feel like I would be terrified to wear it somewhere because I would be afraid that I'm gonna lose it. So I think it's just thinking far enough out when you're making these choices that you're not caught up in the kind of the romanticism of the idea. So burying cremated remains or burying a person to grow into a tree. So there's two ways that I've seen of doing this. One is you take the cremated remains and you put them in this pot that is a urn essentially, but it's kind of like a when you're gardening, it's that kind of cardboardy weird material, and so you put the person in that and you bury it because there's a seed and everything in there. And so as the tree grows, those cremated remains, which are just natural elements of the human body, are going to nourish that tree as it grows. So the big burial pods, which I posted a picture of on the hey, this video is coming up link as well, those are the burial pods. So the body, untreated with chemicals, would be taken in folded fetal position and put in this pod and buried in the ground in a green cemetery or somewhere that this was actually allowed. And then the little seedling is at the top of it, and so as that body decomposes, it's going to nourish and feed the tree. So I think it's one of those things. A lot of these things are happening in Europe and over old country where more is allowed and things are still very old school, back over in old country where we're more staunch on what we do, and we have way more regulations, way more rules. So let's see, eternal reefs. So reefs, they essentially take your cremated remains and they make a artificial reef, and it's a mix of the cremated remains and concrete, and it looks like a reef, and it would have a little placard on it that had your name so people would know who that was. And it helps to replace areas of the reef that are damaged, so that way you're helping nature, you're going back to the water if you liked the ocean maybe, and being part of the eco structure for all eternity. So very interesting. I think it's way more popular obviously on coastlines than it would be in Michigan, unless you wanted to be put in Lake Michigan, but there's not really reefs there. So and then I was doing just a little more research to try and see what companies or what things were out there that maybe I haven't heard of yet even in the industry. And one of them is you could take a vinyl record and when you're living, record something on it, and then after you've died, they take some of your cremated remains and they press it into the vinyl. I don't know how vinyl records are made. I'm not quite sure how this process. There was limited information on it, but I thought it was another kind of off-the-wall thing that someone came up with, and I'm sure few people in the world have done it, but it is another alternative. Mikkel had asked me, how I feel about alternative burials like trees or diamonds, and to each his own. Whatever lets you feel good about what's going to happen. I think it's easy to dream big, and I think it's easy to have those romantic kind of ideas of how things will play out. But I think it also goes back to that, what I've said before, having the conversation with your family, and are they okay with this decision you want for yourself? And I also think I'm a huge firm believer in seeing a person before they're cremated. They don't have to be prepared for public, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, but just that immediate family, having another moment before the person's cremated. I just think there's such it's part of the steps that need to be taken. You know, even if the person dies at home, seeing them almost outside of that kind of where they left there, and seeing them on the next step, and then they go to the crematory from there. I think it's just important to see them one more time, especially if, you know, say Dad's out mowing the grass and he has a heart attack, and the ambulance comes and they've got his shirt ripped open and they've got patches all over him and they've intubated, so he's got this tube sticking out of him, and so that's literally the last time you've seen him, is looking like that, splayed out in the, you know, yard, and shirt ripped open, tube down his throat, you know, eyes possibly open, you know, just all these things. And people will be like, oh, I just want to remember him how he was. Well, that's the last memory you have. Let's have a better one before he's cremated, and you know, let me take out the tube, let me close his eyes, let me close his mouth, let's let you spend a few moments before he goes to the crematory. And just have that one final moment. And I think most people do not regret that. I don't know if I've had any family that had ever said, I regretted seeing Dad or whoever one more time. You know, there's people who are just not going to do it. They don't want to do it. They don't believe in it. And you can't make somebody else believe your beliefs. But I think there's something about that. So to me, that's kind of one of the only things is, you know, the steps leading up to what you do. I think some of these ideas are cool and they're fun and they're unique, and they're a good conversation thing. So when you're talking about the death of a loved one, you can say, but you know what I did? I turned Mom into this diamond. Do you want to see it? Like, it's amazing and it's beautiful and it reminds me of her and her smile, and you know, it's kind of purple, and that was one of her favorite colors, so it's amazing. And you know, so there's these conversations that can be had, which is great, because of all these alternatives that have come about. So it'll be interesting. Everyone says, man, what's the industry going to be like in 10 years? And I can't even imagine some things that are going to come along. So I think next week I'm going to be doing hopefully 2 videos. We're going to do some of the wacky off-the-wall questions that people ask. You know, do they sit up? Do they breathe after they die? You know, kind of body questions, and then also just other off-the-wall questions that people ask. And then I'm going to also do a video about questions that people have, or things that they come in. You know, a lot of times people walk in and go, gosh, well, the commercial on the TV told me that I don't have to pay for anything because I'm a veteran, or Social Security is going to pay for everything, or but if I have this, don't I have to, you know, like misconceptions, things people don't know. So I'm going to clear up a lot of those areas because I like to educate about this business. I just love it. So if you have questions, again, just send them to me. I want to make sure I'm answering things, and this is your opportunity. Ask the funeral director. So I will see you guys soon.